Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. Today I really wanted to talk about some of the advanced reader copies of books that I have been reading recently. So there were some advanced copies of books that came up in my monthly wrap-up, and here are a few more. So these ones are books that are coming up soon. So they'll be sort of released around October, November kind of time, and yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about them. And I should sort of start this by saying the advanced reader copies are basically copies given in advance for in exchange for an honest review. It's a way of sort of getting a bit of extra buzz about a book, or kind of hearing a little bit about, you know, how a book's going to go down, and kind of, you know, giving publishers a bit of a chance to sort of see what the audience is sort of thinking, as it were, about those books. And I have been given quite a few from NetGalley, and this is also a dangerous thing, because I think I was just like, oh, what's this, free books, yes, and then it was just like, oh no, I actually have to read all of them. But as you'll see, it was an absolute pleasure to read most of them, so I'm very grateful for that. And you know, nothing focuses the mind quite like deadlines, it seems. So that's kind of what's happened here. But I just wanted to talk through a few of them. So I alluded to this book slightly in my monthly wrap-up, and that is The Fell by Sarah Moss, which is out in October, I believe. And this book, you know, people who've watched videos of mine before will know that I really enjoy Sarah Moss, and so I was very keen to apply for an ARC for this one. And this, I've also got a separate video coming out on it, just because I thought this book had so much going on that I wanted to really go into detail about it. But The Fell by Sarah Moss is a COVID novel, for all intents and purposes, in the sense that it actually takes place during this time, and I think very cleverly handles the idea of kind of what everything's been looking like for the last year and a half. So it focuses on this character who essentially in the middle of the night goes outside on a walk because she's so sort of stressed at having been kept in because of lockdown procedures and sort of lockdown measures. And so she goes out for a walk, but in doing so gets lost, or goes missing rather, and it's sort of the rest of her sort of village or town all basically trying to find her in the middle of the night on kind of you know, in kind of landscapes that are not really the easiest for that. So it's yeah, I just thought it was a really cleverly done book, and I absolutely adored it. I think it's really interesting as well to see, I mean, we're gonna have a few COVID-y books coming out soon, and I mean, part of me is nervous that a lot of them are just going to be terrible. Like, part of me fears that a lot of them are going to be sort of like, you know, not really scratching beneath the surface at all. But I think what's really clever about The Fell by Sarah Moss is it is very much a novel that could only really have taken place during the current times, but Sarah Moss uses that as a springboard to explore other ideas, instead of, I don't know, moping about it or kind of getting too sucked into that. Instead, I feel like it really cleverly investigates the very weird circumstances of the last year and a half for everybody. So I think it's a really great book that's well worth checking out. And it's quite short as well. It's only about 150 pages or so as well, so quite a quick one to get through. And the next book I read last month, or in September, was another ARC called Reprieve by James Han Mattson. And this book I thought was really interesting, partly because I was purposely trying to push myself to read a little bit outside of the genres I normally read, and this is not a massive step outside of that in some ways, but it is a little bit more thrillery, and for me that's versatility. So the whole idea of this book is that there is a sort of haunted house of some form. It's kind of a haunted house mixed with a kind of escape room, and you go in a team of 4, you kind of work your way through the house, and looking for kind of various bits of, you know, various clues and various envelopes that will have information that will basically help you at the end. And if you succeed, you win a really large amount of money. I want to say it was $100,000. I can't remember the exact number now. And so obviously everyone wants to try, but only one team has ever done it. And Reprieve, the title of this book, comes from the idea that if at any point any one of your teammates shouts the word reprieve, you can make it all stop. and many teams do make it stop because it's so horrendous. You know, it's live action, kind of, there are live actors there, so you know, people running at you, trying to get in your face and scare you and all those kinds of things. And so this book looks at this as a sort of a fallout from it. So where there has been, you know, we start this book basically with hearing sort of court proceedings and hearing sort of legal things that have been, you know, put out against this house, and we sort of slowly realize as we go through the book, sort of through various different characters, that there were a number of things that went wrong, either because certain characters wanted revenge on other people, or certain characters felt a certain way about another person or about something else and wanted to destroy something, or you know, their relationships with each other ultimately made it not work for them. And so this book, I think, does this really interestingly, because you get this slow dread as you're going through the book of knowing that something is going to go horribly wrong, not necessarily knowing exactly what it is, and it's teased out slowly as you go. I thought this was a really fun read. It does some quite clever and fun things as well outside of it. So, you know, as well as being sort of a thriller in a sort of, you know, general sense, it also explores quite a few ideas around, for example, fetishization of race within sort of relationships. It looks at racism more generally, with a few of the characters and how they interact with each other. It looks at these kind of it looks, for example, at sex tourism, and a few other things. So it wraps that up quite interestingly, I thought, and I think was also something that kept my interest, because, you know, the thriller bits, you know, this wasn't a perfect novel for me. I really enjoyed it, but I think, you know, what was really interesting for me was having that balance of sort of something very thrillery, and kind of suspenseful, and that being followed by some really interesting discussions on some various sort of more political points. So I thought that was handled really well, and this book should be out very, very shortly as well. So very exciting to sort of see how you know, various genres you know, keep growing and kind of morphing, and how, I mean, genres as they are anyway are kind of somewhat amorphous and kind of overlap anyway, but I thought this book was a really fun example of that. Next up is a book that I was really excited about reading, because I just thought this sounded like such a fascinating idea. This book is Lea Ypi by J.R. Thorp, and it comes out on the 4th of November. And this book, as the title suggests, is a sort of retelling, or a kind of an imagining of King Lear's wife from the Shakespeare play, and her journey through her relationship with King Lear. And what I just thought was so clever about this book is, in doing that imagining, it really brings out the kind of unheard stories, I guess, of the Shakespeare play. So actually, from my memory at least, it's been a while since I've read King Lear. I might need to go back and reread it. You know, a big part of the idea of King Lear is this idea of King Lear's madness towards the end of the play, and we're meant to see how he sort of loses everything, and you know, he's looked after by his youngest daughter, who's the sort of dutiful one, who, you know, never really wanted, you know, she's never really made claims on him or anything like that. But actually, in that play, as far as I remember, we don't really see much of King Lear's wife. So this is quite an interesting kind of insertion of that, and it reminded me a little bit of Carol Ann Duffy's The World's Wife, which is a poetry collection that really cleverly imagines lots of women from history, either sort of fictional or real, and the kind of understated women, the women who often weren't spoken about, or imagines historical male characters sort of transposed into being women. And so Lea Ypi, what it does really interestingly, I think, is just watch as this woman, King Lear's wife, whose name we only really get right at the end of this book, which again I think is quite a clever point, is, you know, she is somewhat nameless. She's just the queen. She's just Lear's wife, or Lea Ypi as the title is, and as a result, so much of her life is kind of at the service of other people around her. And what I really thought was so clever about that is how it builds on this image of this woman in her sort of later life, who is living in a nunnery, who has been almost rejected and sort of excommunicated almost from this royal family, from lots of people she knew, partly because King Lear thinks that she has had an affair, or he questions a lot about her previous relationships, and we kind of get this really interesting thing of how his male jealousy essentially puts her in a really difficult position and makes her the person who's sort of shunned. And his sort of growing paranoia sort of feeds into that as well. So I thought it was really cleverly handled. A very dense book. The writing style is very lyrical. It kind of I adored Hamnet, which is very lyrical in its own way, but this feels kind of like almost a bit of a love child of Hamnet and Wolf Hall, and I mean that in a very good way. But it does have that kind of density of Hilary Mantel's prose in Wolf Hall, which I know some people loved. I struggled a bit with Wolf Hall, but loved the other two. But yeah, I think it feels like that kind of historical fiction book. And I just thought it was absolutely fascinating. I might do a separate video on this just because I have lots of thoughts on it, and I haven't really quite settled about how I feel in some ways about the book, because I'm sure there was a lot I missed because of the density of the language. It just sort of wears you down a little bit, but some absolutely stunning passages that just blew me away. The ability to capture this sort of woman's life, this kind of inner, real kind of complicated inner life of this woman who has to sort of deal with the kind of Machiavellian sort of politics of court, as in sort of royal court. I just thought it was so fascinating, and yeah, I think it's going to be one of those books that when it comes out in November is going to make a bit of a splash. I hope. I think it deserves it. I think I really can see it being a book that's, for example, shortlisted, also longlisted for maybe the Women's Prize or the Booker next year, because it would be eligible for both. I think so. Yeah. It's a brilliant book, and I really want to hear more people talking about it, because I kind of think it's going to be a lot of people's kind of deal. So yeah, we shall see. The next one I read was Free by Lea Ypi, and this is a really interesting book. This has been longlisted recently for the Baillie Gifford Non-Fiction Prize, and this is a woman's sort of tale of her childhood in Albania, a country that actually I don't think really gets a great deal of international sort of acknowledgement or interest, whether in terms of the news or in terms of sort of writing. So it was really interesting, because I knew very, very little about Albania, and still don't know very much. So I need to learn a lot more. But she guides us through her childhood as some big historical events are taking place in Albania. So we've kind of got the fall of one regime, and you've got this sort of she is born to a family that she only later finds out are Muslims, but they can't practice Islam because of the state, because the state has kind of forbidden all religion. And so she kind of grows up thinking that religion is a bad thing. And there's this really interesting sort of generational divide between her and her parents, because her parents grew up before this sort of revolution and this new sort of set of powers have come in. So she grows up thinking religion is bad, and nobody ever does it. She grows up thinking that certain people are really bad. She grows up with a distinct love for a dictator that her parents do not share that same feeling. And it's interesting because this book builds in a really subtle way. We start the book with her very innocently going through life and whatever, and it comes to this crescendo, and I don't want to spoil it, but the crescendo of the last, I think, like 50 pages or so, is told in a sort of diary form during some attacks. And there is something so heartbreaking about the fact that you've built up with this very innocent girl all the way through. She almost more than anybody else around her doesn't understand what's happening, and she sort of makes that quite clearly. She's really excited about meeting her friends, or like doing this, or like someone, meeting some tourists, or somebody's got some bubble gum that she really wants to have the wrapper from because she just finds it exciting. And then this final passage is just gut-wrenching, because she essentially comes into adulthood, or kind of her childhood is ended almost in that moment. And this book reads both as non-fiction almost, and a kind of memoir, and kind of as a novel. It's a really well put together book, and I totally see why this was on the Baillie Gifford long list for non-fiction. It's a really interesting book, and I'd really, again, would really love to hear people's thoughts on this, because it's a sort of a bit of a creeping book, in the sense that the start of this book does not give you a full sense of what actually comes later in this book. It's very carefully handled, and yeah, really, she's written her socks off for this. It was translated as well, so I think it's interesting to see how the translator also captured some of those parts. And so that last book, Free, comes out on the 28th of October, but all the rest of the ones I'm going to be talking about are out in November. So I'll start off with My Monticello by Jocelyn, Nicole, Johnson, and this is a sort of novella that talks, it's quite an interesting book in how it deals with ideas of race and belonging. At the heart of it is a character who is sort of distantly related to a former president, and she herself being a black woman, lots of people around her are like, yeah, you're just kind of, you're crazy or whatever. And what we really then see is kind of how that builds to her kind of trying to find her place and her role within society, in a kind of backdrop of protests and racism, and people kind of forcing her to pick a side, as it were. So, you know, where do you fit in this land of America? You know, who are you? So I thought this was really cleverly done. And again, I think, I don't know if part of me wanted it to be slightly longer, or you know, this was still a good solid 4 stars for me. But I think for me, I just kind of wanted just a tiny bit of an extra kick towards the end. But I also do recognise that I think I was reading this while quite sleepy, so I'm sure, again, a lot just sort of floated over my head a bit. I was a bit of a careless reader with it, I think, actually. But a really beautiful, really beautiful descriptions in there, and some really clever sort of turns of phrase and clever ways of interacting with ideas as well. Also out on the same day as My Monticello, on the 4th of November, is Seesaw by Timothy Ogene. And this book, this is a real kind of sleeper hit for me, because this whole book is really dry and sarcastic in a way that it takes you a little bit of time, I think, to build into the rhythm of it. And then once you are, you kind of realise how brilliant parts of this book are. So essentially it follows this this writer who, you know, he is... he's a sort of man. He's gone to America to pursue a kind of creative writing fellowship, and he feels a bit like a fraud because he wrote one book that where only 50 copies were made. He looks back and he hates it. He hates this book, but everyone around him is, you know, he gets accepted into this fellowship because somebody caught his book. But what he basically starts to uncover with his sort of dry sarcasm is that a lot of the people sort of really singing the praises of his book seem to be doing it for clout. They're often white people who are talking about his book as a way of almost making themselves look better by kind of saying, like, look at me supporting this poor African writer. And he is, you know, he's on it. He knows what they're doing. But he is himself lost in a bit of a haze. He doesn't really know who he is, what he wants to do, where he sort of fits and where he belongs. And so he sort of just floats through this, through life. And he does it in a really detached, sarcastic way that's really quite entertaining, actually. I really loved the voice and the kind of narration of this book, because the character is so done with everything. he just sort of floats through being like, oh, of course, right, Sandra's talking about my book again, great, love it. And he is just, it's really endearing because like, on the one hand, he's incredibly funny about it, but actually there are really sort of poignant and important things happening. You know, not only discussions on race and on kind of white saviorism of, you know, these kind of white writers, sort of, yeah, the white people behind this fellowship sort of thinking that they are really doing a good thing by supporting this poor black man, but also then some other really interesting intersections on race, because he looks at how, for example, black Americans are treated versus how he is treated. And there's a point when he's pulled over by the police and he intentionally affects a really strong accent to make it seem even more that he is, you know, to basically protect himself, because he knows that if he sounds like a black American, he might be in trouble. But if he sounds like he is a very grateful young African boy, you know, he'll be saved by the police, and that is what happens. And so it has, in all of, despite all of his sort of sarcasm, those points sort of keep coming up in the book. He also meets another African writer, and there's this really interesting discussion between the two of them, because that our main character, our narrator, is sort of done with this writing program, just kind of can't wait for it to end and doesn't submit any stories, and the other person is working constantly to prove himself. And there's something that sets up there about this kind of idea of the sort of the model immigrant or the model citizen and all of those kinds of things. And yeah, so I think this book is really clever behind the scenes, but also just really fun to read. It's, yeah, it kind of, I think a lot of people will enjoy this when it comes out on November 4th. It's just really quite subtle. I think it's a book that you sort of need to really sit with and enjoy the sort of intense sarcasm going on within it. Next was a book that I unfortunately didn't enjoy as much as some of the others, and maybe again I do feel bad in some ways, because I chose a book that is maybe a little bit outside of what I normally read, and so some part of me wants to think that some of my issue with the book is also that maybe it's just not necessarily my type of thing. But I had issues with the writing as well, which doesn't help. So this is Alpha Max by Mark A. Rayner, and this comes out on the 2nd of November. I still think it's a decent book overall. I think it was, you know, it was entertaining, but essentially this is an idea of a kind of a bit of a time travel, a bit of a kind of alternate reality kind of book, which, you know, I can get on board with, all kind of fun. And the thing that really annoys me almost about the fact that I later didn't come to enjoy it as much is that it had almost all the ingredients at the beginning. It felt very kind of Terry Pratchett, you know, that really kind of sarcastic, silly, very British humour, although I don't think the writer's actually British, but it had that kind of Britishness and that kind of sarcasm, and yeah, and I was really prepared to love this. And I think what frustrated me throughout the book is, you know, as these kind of characters are time traveling, there are lots of these little asides, sometimes very funny, sometimes it feels a little bit like he's going for a joke on every sentence, and that can be quite off-putting, because I think the joy with someone like Patchett is, although he makes a lot of jokes, for me, I really enjoy that there'll be sort of quite a lot of fairly serious sort of writing, and then a joke peppered in that kind of catches you off guard. And I think for me, I felt again like it was, I think I've said this a few times in videos recently, but that guy at the bar who's sort of just like, it's funny, right? It's funny. I told another joke, and you're like, oh God, you're exhausting. So yeah, that was kind of my issue with it. And then I think, I mean, a complete side point, and I I rambled about this to Sina over at Beating About the Books, who had to listen to my complaints about this. It also, for me, had a weirdly outdated kind of humour that was like sort of like jokey xenophobia in that kind of gosh, what's that program called? Faulty Towers. And, you know, Faulty Towers, there are some very funny jokes. There are some bits that maybe haven't aged quite as well. And the thing that really put me off with this is, you know, there is a German character in this book, and he just, like, everything he does and says is just like shouting. He plays every single part of a German stereotype. Like, he is very orderly, he's very punctual, he is far too logical and doesn't seem to enjoy any humour at all. He shouts every single sentence. All of his sentences also weirdly begin with German words, but then go on to elucidate in really complex English. So it doesn't make any sense. Like this character, sorry, this complete side rant. And I at some point probably want to do a separate video about this, about dialect choices for characters, because it's something that really bugs me when it's done badly. And for me, this did not work. Which is, yes, like, there are speech patterns that some people will have as a result of their native languages. Yes, that is a thing. And it may be that the German character says ja more than he says yes, because that's just a knee-jerk reaction. I'm okay to believe that. I'm okay to follow that. But to have a character not be able to say there is something, which is the same word order in German. So, you know, this character kind of is always sort of saying, for example, always leaves out there. So he'll just say is place or is dog, which doesn't make sense because Germans don't do that. Like, uh, first grumble, and I think me reading this book, understanding some German, did not help this because I was perhaps a little bit more I was sort of scrutinizing this perhaps slightly more. But a thing that really bugged me was then some of the German was just completely wrong. And I ranted about this again to Sina, who is German, because I'd just finished the book when I went to record the video with her on Mark Nash's book, and the thing that's really sort of, at one point the character basically says there is no room, but it feels like basically what's happened is this person has Google translated every single word of there is no room individually. And so you end up with something that makes absolutely no sense in German, because it's the wrong kind of no, it's the wrong room, no. Yeah. And this is all put in the mouth of the German character who we're also meant to believe is highly educated and will kind of make these sort of very basic grammatical mistakes in English, but then go on to talk about like photon receptors or something, you know, like advanced sort of physics terms. And that really bugs me because I just sort of feel like a little bit of care and attention maybe would have sort of ironed out some of those things, as well as it just being a really ludicrously flat stereotype of a German character. Yeah, yeah. And it's really annoying. And obviously, the thing I should mention as well here about advanced copies is that obviously some of these issues may be fixed by the time the book comes out, in sort of hard copy. And so what I'm saying now may date very badly. It may be fixed by the time this book comes out in about a month's time. However, I just think that really turned me off bits of the book. I think overall it was still, you know, an okay sort of 3 stars for me, which I know for some people is like, yeah, this is a good book. For me, that 3 stars is I had some problems. I still think it's, you know, an enjoyable kind of romp. Like, it's still quite easy and breezy to sort of flick through and read, and enjoyable. I just kind of feel like the author's sort of tone and kind of lack of research perhaps in terms of using German and very flat stereotyping of this German character didn't warm me to the rest of the book. But I mean, if you like kind of sci-fi kind of things, and if this gets fixed in the edit, I can see this being a book that a lot of people will enjoy. So there we go. And to end on a note of a book that I enjoyed quite a lot, These Precious Days by Patchett. And so this book is out on the 23rd of November. It's a book of essays, some of which have been published elsewhere. The only book of Anne Patchett's I've read before was The Dutch House, which for me was just one of the best books I read last year. I read it with my local bookshop as part of their book club, and we all adored The Dutch House. We couldn't stop raving about how beautiful the book was, how poetic and lyrical the sentences were, how touching and poignant the story was, and this same thing comes out in These Precious Days. So this is a book of essays that largely focuses on sort of various parts of Anne Patchett's life. So it's sort of very personal essays. It dips quite a lot into the pandemic in the sort of later part of the essays, but it also covers a lot of other things. So, for example, talking about book covers for her books and her process around that, and how she had some terrible covers that she hated and then made some other decisions that really changed things. It talks a lot about her family, and potentially, you know, there's a really lovely essay called Three Fathers where she talks about the various sort of father figures she's had through her mum's remarrying or whatever else. And it's so touching to hear her talk in different ways about how, you know, what each of them gave her and how she loves them so dearly. And you know, on top of that, there are a few other essays about her becoming a writer, which were really fascinating. But I think the thing that really stopped me in my tracks with this book and just made me absolutely fall in love with it was one of the longer essays towards the end, the titular essay, These Precious Days. And this details her sort of friendship with this woman called Suki. And I don't want to go too much into it because I really urge you to just check out the essay or the book itself. But she essentially has this relationship with this woman called Suki, and they're really good friends, and in this very kind of loving, caring way, they kind of look out for each other, and sometimes they don't speak to each other for a couple of months, but then they're emailing again and looking after each other. And this woman, Suki, during the pandemic, is trying to fight for her life with pancreatic cancer. And it's weird because I think this so easily could have been an essay that felt like it was really self-indulgent or self-promoting, because Anne Patchett talks a lot about caring for this woman and letting this woman stay at her house, but somehow I don't know quite how she manages it with the narrative, that it never at any point feels pitying of this woman. It never feels self-aggrandizing. It never feels sort of overly sentimental and kind of, oh, but what will we do? I have no idea. It's always infused with this kind of very practical realism and really warm, loving positivity and kind of care for each other. And that really comes out in this essay for me, of this kind of nurturing relationship between these two women. At one point in the treatment, particularly during lockdown, they both sort of take up doing exercise videos and yoga together, and it's just it's beautifully done. It's so touching. These two women just looking out for each other in this really strong bond that is sort of it's them almost against the world. And I just found it so moving and so wonderful. So I think it's a really interesting collection. I think earlier into the book I was sort of hovering around 4 stars, and just sort of thought, this is great, some really beautiful things here, but nothing necessarily groundbreaking. But that sort of that essay near the end, These Precious Days, is just so beautiful that I really think this I now really want to buy this collection and give it to many people, because I think it's really very touching. And yeah, Anne Patchett's done it again. I need to go back and read more of her stuff, because I pretty much know I'd love it. Just there's something about the way her insights into people, and into people's motivations and the things that hurt them and the things that healed them, I just think is beautiful. So yeah, very, very excited to check that out. But those have all been some of the arcs that I've been reading recently. I spoke about other arcs in the wrap-up video that have kind of already come out. These are all books that at the time of recording are not yet out. And I do really urge you to go and check some of them out, support some of these authors, especially because I just think, obviously, it's still not the easiest time to be bringing out books, particularly for, new novels for some of these people. And I just think some of these books are just so cleverly done, and I hope are books that we're going to be talking about quite a lot in the coming year, or the coming few months at least. As always, I've been Bob. I'd love to hear some of your comments and thoughts, whether you've read any of these, whether you've read anything by the same authors, any of that kind of jazz, or any other books that we should be looking out for that are coming out soon. I've been Bob. Take care and have a wonderful reading month. Bye-bye.